You think of the Middle Ages. What do you see? Mud, kings, knights in clunky armor, people dying of the plague at 30, in a world without science lit only by superstition. We call them the Dark Ages for a reason, right? It was 1,000 years of waiting for the Renaissance to show up and turn the lights back on. But what if that's a story we tell ourselves? A story that makes us feel smart and advanced. What if those people in the mud were thinking about things we think we invented? Things like social justice, mental health, environmentalism, and a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. What if they were challenging authority and gender roles in ways that would get them trending on Twitter today? They didn't have our words for it. They wouldn't have called it woke, but they were asking the same questions. They were wrestling with the same problems, and sometimes their answers were more radical, more humane, and more surprising than you could ever expect. The past is not a simple story. It is complicated. It is messy, and it is full of people who are just as human as we are. Their world was different, their tools were different, but their minds were not. Number 15. Did they care more about the earth than we do? You picture medieval Europe as a place of exploitation. Chopping down forests to build castles, dumping waste into the street, a world of grime and short-sighted survival. And a lot of that is true. They were not modern environmentalists. They did not have a concept of climate change or plastic pollution. But they had a connection to the land that we have almost completely lost. It was not a theoretical connection. It was a practical one. It was their life. Take the Cistercian monks. Starting in the 11th century, this order became famous for its agriculture. They deliberately sought out wild, uncultivated land, swamps, dense forests, forgotten valleys. They saw it as their spiritual duty to make the wilderness bloom. But they did it with an incredible sophistication. They were masters of hydrology. They could drain a swamp, not just to get rid of it, but to create a system of canals and water meadows. They engineered systems for irrigation and waste management that were centuries ahead of their time. The water that flushed their latrines would then be channeled to fertilize their fields. They understood nutrient cycles in a way we forgot until modern organic farming rediscovered it. Was this for the good of the planet? No, it was for the glory of God and the survival of their abbey. But the result was a form of sustainable agriculture that nurtured the land instead of just stripping it. The historian Lynn White Jr. famously argued in a 1967 article the historical roots of our ecologic crisis, that the Christian worldview of man's dominion over nature was the source of our environmental problems. But the Cistercians show a different side. They saw themselves as stewards, not conquerors. And then there was St. Francis of Assisi. In the early 13th century, he did something truly radical. He preached to the birds, he called the sun, his brother, and the moon his sister. His famous Canticle of the Sun is not just a prayer. It is a poem that sees the divine in all of creation. Brother, sun, sister moon, brother wind, sister water. He saw every part of the natural world as family. This was not a sentimental idea. It was a theological earthquake. It challenged the strict hierarchy that placed humanity at the top, just below God and the angels. And Francis was saying that we are part of a web of creation, not its master. He was decentering humanity a good 700 years before deep ecology came along. Even the laws of the time showed a different relationship with nature. The royal forests of England were not just the king's private hunting grounds. They were vast, managed ecosystems. Under the forest law, common people had rights to use the forest. They could graze their pigs, collect firewood, and forage for food. These rights were jealously guarded. Yes, the king's deer were protected. Poaching was a serious crime, but the law recognized that the forest was a shared resource. It was not just a pile of timber waiting to be cut. It was a living system that supported the community. This is a far cry from a modern corporate clear-cut. They lived closer to the cycles of life and death. They knew which plants could heal you and which could kill you. They knew the patterns of the seasons, not from an app, but from the marrow of their bones. Their survival depended on it. We look back and see superstition. They saw a world alive with meaning, a world they were a part of, not above. They polluted their rivers, yes. They cut down trees, but they never imagined they could destroy the whole system. That is a uniquely modern kind of arrogance. They knew they were small. We think we are big. Maybe that is the biggest difference, but we have so much we don't know. Did the average peasant share St. Francis's view of nature as family, or did they just see it as a brutal force to be survived? How much of the Cistercian sustainable practice was about theology, and how much was just a smart way to get a good crop? And if their connection to the land was so deep, why did they set in motion the very deforestation and exploitation that would eventually lead to our current crisis? From number 14, were women really just silent objects? The standard picture of a medieval woman is pretty bleak. She is a pawn in a marriage alliance. She is the property of her father, then her husband. She cannot own land. She cannot get an education. Her life is a cycle of prayer, childbirth, and drudgery. And for millions of women, that was the reality. The system was designed by men, for men. The law and the church reinforced it. But to say that was the whole story is to ignore some of the most powerful and influential voices of the entire period. Women were not silent. You just have to know where to listen. Let's start with Christine de Pizan. In the late 14th and early 15th century. In France, she did something revolutionary. She became a professional writer. After her husband died, she was left with 3 children and a mountain of debt. Instead of remarrying or entering a convent, the 2 main options for a respectable widow, she picked up a pen. And she did not just write poetry. She wrote one of the first and most important feminist texts in Western history, the Book of the City of Ladies, completed in 1405. The book is a direct response to the rampant misogyny she saw in the literature of her day. It is an allegorical city built by women for women. She systematically refutes the common arguments against women that they are stupid, wicked, and inconstant. She does this by creating a catalog of great women from history and myth, warriors, scholars, artists, rulers. She was building an army of evidence to prove that women were just as capable as men. This was not a quiet suggestion. It was a literary war cry. A woman using the male tool of formal education and writing to dismantle the arguments of men. Or look at Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess from the 12th century. To call her just an abbess is like calling Leonardo da Vinci just a painter. Hildegard was a visionary, a composer, a naturalist, a physician, and a theologian. She wrote books on medicine and botany that were used for centuries. She composed an entire liturgical drama, the Ordo Virtutum, one of the earliest known morality plays. She corresponded with and advised popes, emperors, and kings. They listened to her because they believed she was a prophet, that God spoke through her. But Hildegard used that authority to talk about everything from church corruption to the female orgasm, which she described in her medical text, Case et Cure, in a way that was frank and biological, seeing it as a natural and necessary part of procreation. She was a powerhouse, a woman who, from inside the deeply patriarchal structure of the church, created a space for herself to become one of the most brilliant minds of her age. And it was not just the elite. Take Marjorie Kempe, an English middle-class woman from the early 15th century. She was not a scholar or an abbess. She was a wife, a mother of 14, and a failed businesswoman who tried her hand at brewing and milling. After a difficult childbirth, she had a religious vision, and it changed her life. She decided to dedicate herself to a life of piety, but she did it her way. She negotiated a vow of celibacy with her husband. She went on pilgrimages all over Europe and the Holy Land by herself. And she wept. She was famous for her loud, uncontrollable fits of crying in public, which she believed were a gift from God. The authorities, both church and secular, constantly harassed her. They thought she was a heretic or insane. Yeah, she always talked her way out of it. She knew her theology. She could debate with bishops and archbishops. And then she dictated the story of her life, creating what is arguably the first autobiography in the English language, the Book of Marjorie Kempe. It is a raw, messy, and intensely personal story of a woman trying to find her own spiritual path in a world that did not know what to do with her. These women were not exceptions that proved the rule. They show that the rule was not absolute. Women ran businesses. They inherited property. Guilds often had provisions for a widow to take over her husband's trade. In the cloister of a convent, women had access to education and power that was denied them elsewhere. The world was not simple. It was not a monolith of oppression. Women found the cracks in the system, and through those cracks, they shone. But how many other Christine de Pisans were there whose books were never copied? How many Hildegards were silenced and told their visions were demonic instead of divine? Was Marjorie Kempe a feminist trailblazer or a woman suffering from severe postpartum psychosis who found a religious language to explain her trauma? And does celebrating these extraordinary women make us forget the silent, lived reality of the millions who never had a chance to write their own story? Number 13, who caught you when you fell? We think we invented the social safety net. We have unemployment benefits, social security, public health care. We see the past, especially the medieval past, as a brutal free-for-all. If you got sick, you died. If you lost your job, you starved. If you grew old, you were a burden. It was survival of the fittest. But that is a caricature. They did not have government bureaucracy, but they had something else. They had a powerful sense of community obligation driven by both Christian charity and practical self-interest. They had ways of catching people when they fell. Look at the guilds. We think of them as a kind of proto-union, and they were. They controlled trade, set prices, and ensured quality. A baker's guild made sure all the bakers in town used the same weight for a loaf of bread. But they were much more than that. They were social and religious fraternities. Your guild was your insurance policy. If you were a guild member and you fell sick and could not work, the guild would support you. They paid for a doctor. They gave your family a stipend. If you died, the guild paid for your funeral. A proper funeral was incredibly important. They made sure you were buried with dignity and had prayers said for your soul. They would then support your widow and help find apprenticeships for your children. This was not a handout. It was a system of mutual support. You paid your dues, and in return, the community had your back. It was a social contract written not by a government, but by a group of colleagues. And then there were the hospitals. The word hospital did not mean quite what it means today. They were closer to a mix of a hospital, a homeless shelter, and a nursing home. And they were everywhere. By the 15th century, England alone had hundreds of them. Most were run by the church. Places like St. Bartholomew's in London, founded in 1123, or the Hotel Dieu in Paris, were massive institutions. They took in the sick poor, the elderly, orphans, and pilgrims. The care was not what we would consider scientific today. It was a mix of herbal remedies, prayer, and basic nursing, but it was care. It was a clean bed, it was a warm meal, it was a place of refuge in a harsh world. And it was provided based on need, not the ability to pay. The core principle was Christian charity, the idea that caring for the least of these was a sacred duty. This idea of charity was woven into the fabric of society. Almsgiving was not just something you did if you felt generous. It was a religious obligation. The rich were expected to give to the poor, not just for the good of the poor, but for the good of their own souls. Giving charity was seen as a way to earn salvation. This created a complex social relationship. The poor needed the rich for material support, but the rich needed the poor for their spiritual salvation. This is not to say it was a perfect system. It could be demeaning. It was inconsistent. But it created a flow of wealth from the top to the bottom that was based on a shared set of beliefs about how a Christian society should function. Even the village itself was a safety net. In a world where most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born, your reputation and your relationships were everything. If your barn burned down, your neighbors helped you rebuild it. If your ox died, you might be able to borrow one from a relative. People were interdependent in a way we can barely imagine. This was not always nice. It meant everyone knew your business. It could be stifling, but it also meant you were not alone. Your survival was tied to the survival of the village. We have traded that deep, often difficult, interdependence for a kind of isolated, anonymous freedom. We have a government to catch us. They had each other. But was this system truly compassionate, or was it a form of social control designed to keep the poor docile and grateful? How much of the care in a medieval hospital was just a way to ensure the sick died with their souls in a state of grace, rather than actually trying to cure them? And what happened if you were a stranger, with no guild, no family, and no village to fall back on? Was the medieval world a place of community, or was it a place that was brutally hostile to anyone who was an outsider? Number 12, what happens when the 99% fight back? The story of the Middle Ages is usually a story of kings and nobles. They have the power, the land, the armies. The peasants, the vast majority of the population, are just a backdrop. They toil in the fields, pay their taxes, and die in obscurity. They are silent, oppressed, powerless, but in the summer of 1381, in England, they found their voice. And it was a roar. The peasants' revolt was not just a riot over taxes, it was a social revolution that came terrifyingly close to succeeding. The context was the Black Death. The plague had swept through Europe 3 decades earlier, killing perhaps half the population. This was a human catastrophe, but for the surviving peasants, it had an unexpected side effect. Suddenly, labor was scarce. A lord could not just command a peasant to work his land. The peasant could walk away and find another lord who would pay him more. For the first time, the working class had leverage. They started demanding higher wages, lower rents, and more freedom. The ruling class was terrified. They passed laws like the Statute of Laborers in 1351, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. And they were trying to put the genie back in the bottle. It did not work. The final spark was a new poll tax. It was a flat tax, meaning a poor farmhand paid the same as a rich duke. It was deeply unfair, and people were furious. In May 1381, a tax collector in Essex tried to collect the tax in the village of Fobbing. He was thrown out. When soldiers were sent to enforce the law, they were met by an organized mob of peasants. And then it exploded. All across the southeast of England, ordinary people rose up. They were led by men like Wat Tyler and a radical priest named John Ball. They were not an undisciplined rabble. They marched on London in organized columns. They burned down the houses of unpopular lords and lawyers. They destroyed tax records and legal documents. They were literally erasing the paper evidence of their servitude. Their demands were revolutionary. They did not just want the tax repealed, they wanted an end to serfdom. And serfdom was the system that tied peasants to the land. They were not slaves, but they were not free. They could not leave their village or marry without their lord's permission. The rebels of 1381 wanted to abolish it. They wanted a free market for labor. They wanted the vast lands owned by the church to be seized and divided among the people. And John Ball preached a radical vision of equality that was centuries ahead of its time. His famous sermon included the lines when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman. He was asking a simple, profound question. In the beginning, in the Garden of Eden, there were no lords. There were no serfs, there was just work. Where did this whole system of inequality come from? It was not from God, it was invented by men, and it could be uninvented. The rebels took London. They executed the Archbishop of Canterbury and the king's treasurer. They met with the young King Richard II, who was only 14 years old. For a moment, it looked like they might win. The king agreed to their demands. But it was a trap. During a second meeting, Wat Tyler was killed. The movement lost its leader. The king went back on his promises, and the retribution was brutal. The rebels were hunted down and executed. But something had changed. The ruling class had looked into the abyss. They had seen what happened when you push the common people too far. Although serfdom was not officially abolished, it went into a steep decline. The memory of 1381 was a powerful deterrent. The 99% had shown their power. Then they lost the battle, but in the long run, they may have won the war. We think of class consciousness and labor movements as inventions of the Industrial Revolution. We think of Karl Marx and factories, but the peasants of 1381 were fighting the same fight. They were fighting for their dignity. They were fighting for the idea that the person who does the work should get the reward. They were fighting for the idea that no one is born better than anyone else. But what did they really want? Did they have a coherent plan for a new society? Or were they just a furious mob lashing out at their oppressors? How did a group of supposedly uneducated peasants organize a military campaign that captured the capital city? And is the story of the revolt a lesson in the power of the people, or a warning about how easily popular movements can be betrayed and crushed by the powerful? In number 11, was their world bigger than we think? We tend to imagine the medieval world as small and isolated. A peasant is born in a village and dies in that same village. Their entire universe is the distance they can walk in a day. Europe is a closed, fearful Christian box cut off from the rest of the world. And for many people that was true, but it was not the whole truth. The medieval world was crisscrossed by networks of trade, pilgrimage, and ideas. It was far more connected and far more multicultural than we give it credit for. Think of the Silk Road. It was not a single road, but a vast network of trade routes connecting China and the Far East with the Middle East and Europe. Spices, silk, and porcelain flowed west. Gold, silver, and wool flowed east. But it was not just goods that traveled these routes. It was ideas, technology, and religions. The knowledge of papermaking, gunpowder, and the compass came to Europe from China along these paths. The art of the Byzantine Empire shows clear influences from Persian and Eastern design. This was not a one-way street. It was a constant flowing exchange, and people traveled. Not just merchants. Pilgrims were constantly on the move. A Christian from England might travel all the way to Rome or even to Jerusalem, and a Muslim from Spain might make the Hajj to Mecca. These journeys were long, dangerous, and expensive, but hundreds of thousands of people made them. Along the way, they met people from different cultures. They saw different ways of life. They stayed in hostels and monasteries set up specifically for travelers. These routes of faith were also routes of communication. A pilgrim returning from Santiago de Compostela in Spain might bring back a new song, a new story, or a new idea. Perhaps the greatest example of this interconnected world was in medieval Spain, a place known as Al-Andalus. For several centuries, from the 8th to the 15th, large parts of Spain were under Muslim rule. And in cities like Cordoba and Toledo, something remarkable happened. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived together in a state of relative peace and cooperation known as convivencia, or coexistence. It was not a utopia. There were tensions and periods of persecution, but for a time, it was one of the most intellectually vibrant places on earth. Cordoba, in the 10th century, was the largest city in Europe. It had streetlights, hospitals, and a library with 400,000 books at a time when the largest library in Christian Europe had maybe 400. Scholars from all three faiths worked together. They translated the great works of Greek philosophy and science from Arabic into Latin. It was through these translations that Aristotle and other classical thinkers were reintroduced to Western Europe, paving the way for the Renaissance. This was not a clash of civilizations, it was a fusion, and individuals made incredible journeys. We all know about Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who traveled to China in the 13th century and served in the court of Kublai Khan. His book was a bestseller, opening the eyes of Europeans to a world they could barely imagine. But even more impressive was his contemporary Ibn Battuta, a Muslim scholar from Morocco. He set out on the Hajj in 1325 and did not stop traveling for almost 30 years. He covered an estimated 75,000 miles. He went to Egypt, Persia, India, China, and deep into Africa. His travelogue, the Rihla, is a stunning account of the diversity of the 14th century world. He showed that the Islamic world was not a monolith, but a vast, interconnected network of cultures. The Vikings, often portrayed as simple raiders, were also incredible explorers and traders. They established trade routes that stretched from Newfoundland in the west to Constantinople in the east. They traded with the native peoples of North America 500 years before Columbus. They served as elite mercenaries for the Byzantine Emperor. They were a bridge between worlds. So the idea of a fortress Europe, isolated and ignorant, is a myth. They were connected. They were curious. They were influenced by cultures and ideas from thousands of miles away. Their world was big, and they knew it. But how deep did this multiculturalism go? Was the convivencia in Spain a genuine model of tolerance, or just a pragmatic arrangement that could be easily broken? For every Marco Polo who traveled and wrote, how many thousands of merchants and pilgrims left no record of their journeys? And how did the average person in a small English village process the news of a world filled with Saracens, Mongols, and strange empires? Was it a source of wonder, or just a source of fear? Number 10. Can you put a king in his place? The image of a medieval king is one of absolute power. What the king says goes. His word is law. He can tax you, imprison you, even execute you on a whim. He rules by divine right. His authority comes from God, and to challenge the king is to challenge God. This is the simple picture, but on a meadow called Runnymede by the River Thames on June 15, 1215, that picture was shattered. That was the day a group of rebellious barons forced King John of England to sign the Magna Carta. And King John was a terrible king. He was greedy, cruel, and incompetent. He had lost most of England's territories in France. He had fought with the Pope and gotten the entire country excommunicated. And he squeezed his barons for every penny they had, imposing arbitrary taxes and fines. He was a tyrant, and the barons had had enough. They raised an army and captured London. Great John was forced to negotiate. The result was the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Most of the charter deals with specific grievances of the barons. It is about inheritance rights, feudal payments, and the rules of royal forests. It is not a stirring declaration of human rights for all people. It was a deal cut by the 1% of the time to protect their own interests. But buried within its 63 clauses were a few ideas that would change the world. The most famous is Clause 39. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. This is the seat of due process. The idea that you cannot just be thrown in jail because the person in power does not like you. There has to be a legal process. There has to be a trial by a jury of your peers. Another crucial clause stated that no new tax could be levied without the common council of our kingdom. This established the principle of no taxation without representation. The king could not just take your money. He had to get the consent of the powerful men of the realm. This was the beginning of the English Parliament. But the most important idea of all was the one that underpinned the whole document. The king was subject to the law. He was not above it. The law was a power in itself, and even the king had to obey it. If he broke the law, his people had the right to rebel. This was a revolutionary concept. It completely undermined the idea of divine absolute monarchy. It said that power comes not just from God, but from an agreement between the ruler and the ruled. The Magna Carta was not an instant success. King John repudiated it almost immediately with the help of the Pope. A civil war broke out. But the idea had been born. The charter was reissued several times by later kings. It became a symbol. Over the centuries, it was forgotten and rediscovered. In the 17th century, lawyers like Sir Edward Coke used it to fight the Stuart kings and establish the supremacy of Parliament. The American colonists used it to justify their rebellion against King George III. Its principles are embedded in the U.S. Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A document written to solve a squabble between a bad king and his wealthy barons became the foundation for modern democracy and the rule of law. It was a message from the 13th century that still resonates today. No one is above the law. Not a baron, not a bishop, and not even a king. But was the Magna Carta really a document of freedom, or was it just a power grab by a group of aristocrats who wanted more control for themselves? How did an obscure Latin charter, written for a tiny elite, become a universal symbol of liberty for common people centuries later? And if the law of the land is created by the powerful, can it ever truly deliver justice for the powerless? As number 9, how did they handle a broken mind? When we think of mental health in the Middle Ages, we tend to think of demons and exorcisms. We imagine people with depression or anxiety being chained up, accused of witchcraft, or subjected to brutal treatments. And there is some truth to that. Their understanding of the brain was limited. They saw the world through a lens of faith and superstition. But to dismiss their approach as purely barbaric and ignorant is to miss a surprisingly nuanced and often compassionate system of thought. They did not have our labels, but they recognized the suffering. The dominant medical theory inherited from the ancient Greeks was humorism. The idea was that the body contained 4 basic fluids, or humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. A healthy person had these humors in balance. Illness, both physical and mental, was caused by an imbalance. Each humor was associated with a temperament. An excess of blood made you sanguine, cheerful. An excess of phlegm made you phlegmatic.com. An excess of yellow bile made you choleric, angry. And an excess of black bile caused melancholia. Melancholy was the medieval term for what we might now call depression, and it was taken very seriously. Doctors and scholars wrote extensively about it. They saw it as a genuine illness, not just a moral failing. Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy, published in 1621, is a massive summary of centuries of thought on the subject. It is a work of the early modern period, but its roots are deeply medieval. Burton identified dozens of causes for melancholy. Some were physical, like diet or lack of sleep. Others were social, like poverty, fear, and loneliness, and some were what we would call psychological grief, jealousy, and even too much study. The treatments were based on this theory. The goal was to rebalance the humors. This could involve diet. A melancholic person suffering from an excess of cold, dry, black bile might be told to eat warm, moist foods. It could involve herbal remedies. It could also involve bloodletting, which seems brutal to us, but was seen as a logical way to remove an excess humor. But the treatments were not just physical. Doctors recognized the connection between the mind and body. They prescribed music therapy, travel, and meaningful work. They recommended talking about your problems with a trusted friend. The Cistercian monk Elred of Revolx wrote in the 12th century about the importance of spiritual friendship, describing it as a space where you may commit all the secrets of your heart. This sounds a lot like modern talk therapy. Of course, there was a spiritual dimension. Melancholy could be seen as a spiritual trial, a dark night of the soul, as the mystic St. John of the Cross would later call it. It could also be seen as the sin of acedia, or sloth, not laziness, but a kind of spiritual despair, a feeling that life was meaningless and God was distant. The treatment for this was prayer, confession, and a return to a structured, meaningful life. But even here, it was not always about punishment. It was about healing. Consider the strange case of Marjorie Kempe again. With her loud public weeping and dramatic visions, today she might be diagnosed with any number of conditions, from bipolar disorder to post-traumatic stress. She was examined by the authorities multiple times, and while some accused her of heresy, no one ever officially declared her insane. They listened to her, they debated with her, they might not have understood her, but they engaged with her. They had a space in their worldview for someone like her. It was a spiritual space, but it was a space nonetheless. We have better science now. We have pharmaceuticals, but we have also medicalized sadness and spiritualized distress out of existence. They saw the whole person, the body, the mind, the soul, and the social context were all connected. Their cures might have been wrong, but their diagnosis of the human condition was surprisingly holistic. But how did they distinguish between a holy vision and a demonic one? Where was the line between melancholy as a treatable illness and acedia as a damnable sin? And in a world that offered compassion and community, what horrors awaited those whose mental distress was too strange or too frightening for their neighbors to understand. Number 8, were they really afraid of knowledge? The Dark Ages? The name itself says it all. A time when the light of classical reason was extinguished, a time of ignorance and superstition, when the church suppressed science and burned anyone who dared to ask questions. We picture monks mindlessly copying the Bible, terrified of new ideas. We picture Galileo, centuries later, being punished for looking through a telescope. This story is simple, it is dramatic, and it is mostly wrong. The Middle Ages was not a scientific wasteland. It was a period of slow, steady, and sometimes brilliant intellectual work that laid the foundations for the scientific revolution. First, let's talk about preservation. After the fall of the Roman Empire, it was the Christian monasteries that saved Western learning. Monks in places like Ireland and Italy painstakingly copied not just the Bible, but also the works of Roman authors and the scraps of Greek science they still had. Without these scribes, this knowledge would have been lost forever. And as we saw in Spain, it was the Islamic world that preserved and expanded upon the great works of Greek science, mathematics, and medicine. When this knowledge flowed back into Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries, it caused an intellectual explosion. This explosion led to the creation of one of the great medieval inventions, the university. Starting in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford in the 12th century, these were new kinds of institutions. They were self-governing corporations of scholars. They developed a curriculum based on the 7 liberal arts, but they quickly expanded to include law, medicine, and theology. And the core of their method was something called scholasticism. We think of scholasticism as dry and pointless, like arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. But at its heart, it was a rigorous system of logical argument. A scholar would pose a question. He would then list all the arguments for and against it, citing the Bible, the Church Fathers, Aristotle, and other authorities. Finally, he would offer his own resolution, systematically refuting the arguments he disagreed with. This was critical thinking. It taught generations of students how to analyze a text, construct an argument, and debate a point. It was a mental toolkit, and some people used that toolkit to push the boundaries of knowledge. Think of Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar in 13th century England. He was a fierce critic of the scholastic method when it was based only on flawed old texts. He argued for a new kind of knowledge, one based on experience and experimentation. He wrote, "For the things of this world cannot be made known without a knowledge of mathematics." He studied optics and experimented with lenses, describing something very much like a telescope. He predicted flying machines and motorized carriages. He was so far ahead of his time that many of his colleagues thought he was a magician. He was even placed under house arrest for a time, but he was not an isolated genius. He was part of a vibrant intellectual culture that was deeply curious about the natural world. This curiosity was everywhere. The builders of the great Gothic cathedrals were not just pious craftsmen. They were brilliant engineers. They had a deep practical understanding of physics and geometry. They figured out how to use flying buttresses and ribbed vaults to build structures that were taller and lighter than anything that had come before, flooding them with light through massive stained glass windows. This was applied science of the highest order. The church was not always the enemy of this process. It was the primary patron of it. The universities were church institutions. Roger Bacon was a friar. The cathedral builders were working for the glory of God. They did not see a conflict between faith and reason. For them, studying the natural world was a way of understanding God's creation. Reason was a gift from God, meant to be used. The conflict between science and religion that we take for granted is largely a modern invention. But was Roger Bacon a true scientist, or was he a man still caught between a world of magic and a world of experiment? How free were the scholars at the new universities to ask questions that might challenge fundamental church doctrine? And if the medieval period was so intellectually vibrant, why did it take until the 17th century for the scientific revolution to truly ignite? What was holding them back? Number 7, did a pig have a right to a fair trial? This sounds like a joke. A pig in a courtroom on trial for murder, but it was not a joke. From the 13th to the 18th century across Europe, there are records of hundreds of animal trials. Pigs, rats, dogs, and even insects were put on trial for crimes. They were assigned a lawyer. Witnesses were called, a verdict was rendered, and if found guilty, the animal would be formally executed, often by hanging. It is one of the strangest corners of medieval history, and it tells us something profound about how they saw the world. The most common defendants were pigs. In a medieval village, pigs often roamed freely. They were a major source of food, but they could also be dangerous. There are numerous records of pigs attacking and killing small children. When this happened, the community did not just kill the pig, they arrested it. Yes, they put it in jail, and they held a formal trial. In 1386, in Falaise, France, a pig was found guilty of murdering a baby. The pig was dressed in human clothes, maimed in the head and leg to match the baby's injuries, and then publicly hanged. The court records note the cost of the executioner's services and a new pair of gloves for him. This was not a back alley killing, it was a formal legal proceeding. It was not just individual animals. Sometimes entire species were put on trial. If a field was being destroyed by locusts or weevils, the church court might get involved. The insects would be formally summoned to appear. A lawyer would be appointed to defend them. The lawyer might argue that the insects were God's creatures, and they had a right to eat. The court might then issue a compromise. The insects would be ordered to leave the field and move to another designated plot of land. If they refused, they would be excommunicated. Like, what is going on here? Our first reaction is to laugh. It seems absurd. But it comes from a worldview that was radically different from ours. For us, there is a clear line. Humans have moral agency. We know right from wrong. Animals are just things. They act on instinct. They cannot be guilty of a crime. We might put down a dangerous dog, but we would not say it was morally responsible for its actions. The medieval world did not draw that line so clearly. They believed in a single, unified cosmic order created by God. And everything in that order was subject to God's law. Humans, animals, even the land itself. When a pig killed a child, it was not just a tragic accident. It was a disruption of that cosmic order. A crime had been committed, justice had to be done, not just for the human community, but for the entire universe. The trial was a way of restoring the balance. It was a ritual to show that the community was taking the crime seriously and setting things right again in the eyes of God. Appointing a lawyer for the rats was not a joke. It showed that they believed even the lowest of creatures had a place in God's plan. The legal scholar E.P. Evans, who wrote a classic book on the subject in 1906 called The Criminal Prosecution and Capital Punishment of Animals, saw it as a sign of a society that was trying to apply its highest ideals of justice to every part of creation. It was a way of making sense of a world where random, terrible things happened. It was an attempt to impose human justice on the chaos of nature. It also connects to a broader view of animals. Think of St. Francis preaching to the birds, or the medieval bestiaries, beautifully illustrated books that described animals not just by their physical characteristics, but by their moral and spiritual significance. The lion was a symbol of Christ. The pelican, who was thought to pierce its own breast to feed its young with its blood, was a symbol of sacrifice. Animals were not just beasts, they were part of a divine story, they were moral actors. So, if a lion could represent Christ, why couldn't a pig represent a murderer? So, did they believe animals had souls? If a pig was hanged, was it sent to hell? Did the lawyers for the weevils actually expect their clients to obey the court order? And what does it say about us? That we have completely separated our world of human justice from the natural world, treating animals as property with no rights or moral standing of their own. Number 6. What did it mean to be a man or a woman? The medieval world seems to have very rigid gender roles. Men fight, rule, and work the fields. Women pray, run the household, and have children. It is a world of knights and damsels, of fathers and patriarchs. The rules were strict, laid down by the church and society, but human beings are never that simple. The Middle Ages was also a time when people explored and sometimes crossed the boundaries of gender in surprising ways. Consider Joan of Arc, a teenage peasant girl in 15th century France. She hears voices from God telling her to lead the French army against the English. She cuts her hair short, she dresses in men's clothes and armor, and she does it. She leads an army. She inspires a nation. She is a warrior. She completely shatters every expectation of what a woman was supposed to be. And of course, the authorities could not handle it. When she was captured by the English and their French allies, they put her on trial for heresy. And one of the main charges against her was cross-dressing. It was seen as an abomination, a violation of God's law. For her enemies, her refusal to wear a dress was proof that she was a witch, a heretic, a tool of the devil. But for Joan, her male clothing was a practical necessity for a soldier. It was also a sign of her divine mission. She was operating outside the normal rules of society. She was a woman who lived, fought, and died as a man. And she was not the only one. There was a popular and recurring theme in the stories of saints, the transvestite saint. These were stories of women who disguised themselves as men to enter a monastery and live a life of religious devotion that was otherwise closed to them. Saint Marinos the monk, Saint Theodora, Saint Apollinaria. The stories vary, but the pattern is similar. A woman adopts a male name and a male identity. She lives for years as a monk, her biological sex undiscovered. Often, she is a model of piety and virtue. In some stories, her identity is only discovered after her death. These were not seen as cautionary tales about the dangers of crossing gender lines. They were celebrated. These women were seen as heroes of the faith. By renouncing their female identity, they were seen as renouncing the world and its temptations, achieving a higher, more spiritual state. This was not about gender identity in the modern sense. They did not have our concepts of transgender or non-binary. But they were wrestling with the idea that your social role was not necessarily fixed by your biology. In a spiritual context, it was possible to transcend the category of woman and become something else. Then there was the world of courtly love. This was a literary and cultural phenomenon that flourished among the nobility of France in the 12th century and then spread across Europe. The poetry of the troubadours described a new kind of love. It was a love that was secret, often adulterous and intensely emotional. And it often reversed the traditional power dynamics. The knight was the humble servant of his beloved lady. He swore absolute loyalty to her. She was his lord, his maidens, a masculine term. He would perform great deeds to be worthy of her. She held all the power in the relationship. She could grant him her favor or reject him. This was a fantasy, a literary game. It did not reflect the reality of most marriages, which were political and economic arrangements. But it created a cultural space where a woman could be imagined as powerful, dominant, and in control. It taught a generation of aristocratic men a language of emotional complexity and deference to women. The world was not as black and white as we imagine. It was a place where a woman could be a warrior, a saint could be a man, and a lady could be a lord. They were constrained by rigid rules, but they were also fascinated by what happened when you broke them. But were these stories of cross-dressing saints a form of proto-feminism, or were they actually misogynistic, suggesting that to be holy, a woman had to become like a man? Was courtly love a genuine elevation of women, or was it just a sophisticated game that left the real structures of patriarchy untouched? And what was the lived experience of people who simply did not fit into the neat boxes of male and female in a world that had no words for them. Number 5 was being poor, a radical act. Our society worships wealth. Success is measured in money, possessions, and status. We see poverty as a failure, a problem to be solved, or a source of shame. The medieval world had a much more complicated and often contradictory relationship with wealth. On one hand, you had powerful kings and bishops who lived in incredible luxury. On the other hand, you had a powerful spiritual tradition that saw poverty not as a failure, but as a path to God. And for some, choosing to be poor was the most radical political statement you could make. The central figure here is Jesus. In the Gospels, he says, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." He tells his followers to sell their possessions and give the money to the poor. The early Christian church was a community that shared its resources. This ideal of apostolic poverty was a powerful force throughout the Middle Ages. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the church had become incredibly wealthy and powerful. The Pope was a major political player, bishops were like princes, monasteries owned vast tracts of land, and many people felt that the church had lost its way. It had forgotten the simple message of Jesus. This led to a series of powerful reform movements. The most famous was led by St. Francis of Assisi. Francis was the son of a wealthy cloth merchant. As a young man, he lived a life of privilege and parties. But after a spiritual crisis, he renounced it all. He literally stripped off his fine clothes in the public square, gave them back to his father, and walked away with nothing. He chose a life of absolute poverty. He begged for his food. He wore a simple robe. He lived and worked among the poor and the lepers. He attracted a huge following of people who were inspired by his radical simplicity. They became the Franciscans, or the Friars Minor, the Lesser Brothers. This was not just about personal piety. It was an implicit critique of the wealth and power of the institutional church. Francis was showing by his example a different way to be a Christian, a way that was based on humility, service, and a rejection of materialism. He did not directly challenge the Pope. In fact, he sought and received the Pope's approval for his new order. But the message was clear, and it was wildly popular. At the same time, another order, the Dominicans, was founded by Saint Dominic. They also took a vow of poverty. They were known as the Order of Preachers. They traveled from town to town, teaching and preaching, living on charity. Both the Franciscans and the Dominicans were known as mendicant or begging orders. They represented a massive spiritual revival that swept across Europe. This idea that voluntary poverty was a holy state had a huge impact on society. It meant that the poor were not just a social problem, they had a special spiritual status. They were God's poor. Giving charity to them was not just a good deed, it was a way of serving Christ himself. But this idea was also dangerous. If poverty was holy, then maybe wealth was wicked. Some groups took this idea to its extreme. The Waldensians, a movement that started in the late 12th century, preached apostolic poverty, but also began to challenge the authority of the clergy, arguing that a priest's power came from his moral purity, not his office. They were declared heretics and brutally suppressed. The line between a holy reform movement and a dangerous heresy was a thin one. So, in a world of stark inequality, the deliberate choice to be poor was a powerful statement. It challenged the values of the rich and powerful. It questioned the direction of the church. It was a reminder of a different set of values, a different way of measuring a human life. Not by what you own, but by what you are willing to give up. But was the Franciscan movement a genuine social critique, or was it co-opted by the church to become a safe, institutionalized way of channeling discontent? How did the average peasant, who was poor by necessity, feel about the wealthy nobleman's son who was being celebrated for choosing a life of poverty? And can a society that believes poverty is holy ever truly commit to eliminating it? Number 4, did they have a better work-life balance? We live in a culture of overwork. We are always connected. We answer emails at midnight. We brag about how busy we are. We have 2-day weekends and a few weeks of vacation a year if we are lucky. We see the medieval peasant as a drudge working from sunup to sundown in a life of endless, back-breaking labor. But what if they actually had more time off than we do? The medieval work year was not structured by a 5-day work week and a corporate calendar. It was structured by the sun, the seasons, and the church. And the church calendar was filled with holidays, or rather, holy days. There was Sunday, of course, which was a day of rest and prayer. But then there were the major feasts, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost. Each of these came with extended periods of celebration. The 12 days of Christmas was a real thing. Easter week was a time of no work. It did not stop there. There were dozens of other holy days throughout the year, like saints' days. Feasts for the Virgin Mary, days to mark important events in the life of Christ. Each village might have its own local saint's day, which would be a major festival. The economist Juliet Schor, in her book The Overworked American, estimated that the average medieval peasant had a shocking amount of leisure time. She calculates that, besides Sundays, there were between 8 weeks and 6 months of the year that were considered holidays. Even the lowest estimates suggest they had more days off than the average American worker does today. Of course, the nature of their work was different. Agricultural work is seasonal. There were periods of intense labor, like planting and harvesting, when people would work from dawn till dusk. But there were also long, slow periods, especially in the middle of winter, when there was less to do. The work was physically much harder than most of our jobs, but it was not the relentless year-round grind we often imagine. And when they did have time off, they celebrated. A saint's day was not just a day off from work. It was a feast, a party. There would be a special church service, followed by drinking, dancing, and games. These festivals were the glue that held the community together. They were a break from the monotony of daily life. They marked the passing of the seasons. They were a time for a kind of sanctioned chaos, a release of tension. The Feast of Fools, for example, was a day when the social order was turned upside down. A junior clergyman would be elected bishop for a day and would mock the solemn rituals of the church. It was a safety valve for a society that was otherwise very hierarchical. This rhythm of life, with its regular and frequent breaks, was not based on productivity or economic efficiency. It was based on a shared belief system. Time did not belong to your employer. It did not even belong to you, it belonged to God. And a significant portion of that time was set aside for God, which in practice meant for rest, celebration, and community. We have gained much in terms of material comfort and life expectancy, but we have lost this rhythm. We have traded a calendar based on shared rituals for one based on the quarterly earnings report. We have flattened time into a series of identical, interchangeable workdays. They were poorer than we are in every material way, but they may have been richer in one thing: we crave time. But how much of this leisure was just unwanted idleness during these slow agricultural seasons? Were these holidays a genuine gift of rest, or a form of social control designed to keep a potentially rebellious population happy with bread and circuses? And what does it say about our progress that a 13th century farmer may have had more vacation days than a 21st century software engineer? Number 3, was it dangerous to ask why? The medieval church is often seen as a monolith of dogmatic certainty. It had all the answers. The Bible and the church fathers had explained the world. The job of a good Christian was to believe, not to question. To ask why too insistently was to flirt with heresy, and heresy was a crime that could get you killed. There is truth in this. The church did not value free thought in the modern sense. But within the walls of the universities and monasteries, a culture of intense and sometimes dangerous questioning was very much alive. I'd meet Peter Abelard, a brilliant, arrogant, and charismatic philosopher in 12th century Paris. He was a rock star of his day. Students flocked from all over Europe to hear him lecture. And his method was revolutionary. He wrote a book called Sic et Non, which means yes and no. In it, he took 158 fundamental questions of Christian theology. For example, should human faith be based on reason, or no? And is God a single unity, or no? For each question, he listed all the authorities he could find on both sides. He would quote a church father who said yes, and then another who said no. He showed that the supposedly unified tradition of the church was full of contradictions. And then he just left it there. He did not provide the answers. He told his students, by doubting, we are led to inquire, and by inquiry, we perceive the truth. This was radical. He was teaching his students to think for themselves, to question authority, to use the tool of logic to solve the deepest mysteries of faith. Of course, this made him powerful enemies. The more traditional theologians, like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, were horrified. They saw Abelard as a man who was using his arrogant intellect to tear down the sacred truths of the faith. Abelard was eventually condemned for heresy. His books were burned. He was forced into a monastery. His famous and tragic love affair with his student Heloise did not help his case. But his method had a huge impact. The question format he developed became the standard method of teaching in the new universities. He had shown that questioning was not the enemy of faith, but the path to a deeper understanding of it. The whole system of scholasticism, which Abelard helped to create, was based on asking why. Free thinkers like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century took on the biggest questions imaginable. Does God exist? What is the nature of the soul? How can a good God allow evil to exist? His masterpiece, the Summa Theologica, is a massive work of thousands of pages. It is structured as a series of questions. For each question, he presents the objections, then his own answer, and then a reply to each objection. He was not just stating dogma, he was building a rational case for it. He was trying to show that the Christian faith was not contrary to reason, but was its ultimate fulfillment. He famously used the philosophy of the pagan Aristotle to build his Christian system. He was not afraid of a good question. This did not mean there were no limits. There were, if your questions led you to conclusions that contradicted fundamental doctrines like the divinity of Christ or the authority of the church, you were in trouble. The church had a system for dealing with this, the Inquisition. The Inquisition was not, in its early days, the chamber of horrors we see in movies. It was a legal process designed to identify and correct heretical beliefs, but it could be brutal. And the threat of it certainly created a climate of fear, but even the existence of heresy shows that people were thinking for themselves. Heresies like the Catholic movement in southern France were not just random errors. They were complete alternative theological systems. They were the result of people asking why and coming up with their own answers. The church saw this as a deadly threat that had to be stamped out, but it is also evidence of a world that was far from intellectually uniform. People were thinking, they were arguing, they were asking why, and sometimes they were willing to die for their answers. But was Abelard a pioneer of free thought, or was he just a clever debater who never really challenged the core assumptions of his faith? Did the scholastic method encourage genuine inquiry, or was it just a closed loop, a system for proving what you already believed? And how many thinkers less famous and less protected than Aquinas were silenced before they could even formulate their dangerous questions? And number two, did they understand love better than we do? When we think of medieval relationships, we think of arranged marriages, a joyless, practical business of joining two families, two fortunes, two pieces of land. Love was a luxury, if it was considered at all. And then we think of courtly love, with its knights sighing over unattainable ladies. It seems like a world with no space for real human love as we know it, a world of either cold contracts or silly fantasies. But this misses the deep and complex ways they thought about human connection. Let's go back to courtly love. It is easy to dismiss it as a silly game, but it was a game that taught a new emotional language. Before the troubadours, the main virtues of a knight were purely military bravery, loyalty to his lord, skill in battle. The poetry of courtly love introduced a new set of virtues: patience, devotion, refinement, and a deep sensitivity to emotion. It celebrated a kind of love that was a chosen, intense, and often painful personal experience. It was not about procreation or social stability, it was about the inner life of the lover. The poetry is full of detailed descriptions of the lover's suffering as sleepless nights, his loss of appetite, his constant anxiety. This was a form of emotional intelligence training for a warrior class. It taught them to value feelings. And it was not just about men. The tradition also included female poets, the trouberites, who wrote from the woman's point of view. They wrote about their own desires, their own frustrations, their own power. This was a world where love was a topic for serious artistic exploration. Andreas Capellanus, in the late 12th century, wrote a famous treatise called The Art of Courtly Love. It is a kind of manual for lovers. It is full of strange rules and pronouncements. Marriage is no real excuse for not loving, but it is also a serious attempt to analyze the psychology of love. It treats love as a noble and civilizing force, an art that can be learned and perfected. But what about real people? What about marriage? It is true that for the nobility, marriage was often a strategic alliance. But that does not mean love could not grow within it. And for ordinary people, there was often more freedom to choose a partner. In church law, by the High Middle Ages, was clear that a valid marriage required the free consent of both the man and the woman. This was a radical idea. It meant that, in theory, a father could not force his daughter to marry against her will. In practice, social pressure was immense, but the principle was there. Consent was central. And we have glimpses of real affection. The letters between Abelard and Heloise are a testament to one of the great love stories of history, full of passion, intellect, and tragedy. On a more domestic level, we have things like the Ménagère de Paris, a book written by an elderly Parisian merchant for his young wife in the 1390s. It is a guide to running a household. It includes recipes and tips on how to hire servants. But it is also filled with a tender of paternalistic affection. He is clearly devoted to his young wife and wants her to be happy and successful. Then there was the concept of friendship. Ared of Rieuvolx, the 12th century Cistercian abbot, wrote a beautiful book called On Spiritual Friendship. He describes friendship as one of the greatest gifts of human life, a path to God. He outlines different kinds of friendship, from the superficial to the deeply spiritual. He describes a true friend as someone you can share your deepest self with, someone who will challenge you and support you. He writes, "And so, in friendship, we are joined to our friend in a sweet bond of love, and become one heart and one soul." This was not about romance. It was about a deep, committed, loving connection between two people. They may not have had our modern romantic ideal of a marriage based solely on love, but they had a rich and varied understanding of human connection. They valued passion, consent, friendship, and devotion. They saw love not just as an emotion, but as a virtue to be cultivated, an art to be practiced, a path to understanding both yourself and God. But was courtly love a liberating fantasy or a deeply misogynistic one that placed women on an impossible pedestal? How often was the church's ideal of consent in marriage actually respected in a society where women had so little power? And in a world without our modern language of psychology, how did people navigate the messy, painful, and complicated realities of their own hearts? Number one, what did they see in the people we ignore? Our modern world is obsessed with productivity, intelligence, and perfection. We value the CEO, the scientist, the athlete. We have little time for people who do not fit. People with cognitive disabilities, with physical deformities, with eccentric personalities. We hide them away in institutions, we medicate them, we try to make them normal, or we simply ignore them. The medieval world, for all its brutality, had a different way of seeing. They found a place, and sometimes a profound meaning, in the people we would dismiss. Consider the role of the court jester, or the fool. We think of them as simple clowns, there to entertain the king. But the best of them were much more than that. The fool had a unique and privileged position. He was the one person who could speak truth to power. He could mock the king, criticize the nobles, and point out the absurdity of a situation without getting his head cut off. He operated outside the normal rules of the court. His foolishness gave him a kind of license to be wise. Shakespeare's plays are full of these characters. The fool in King Lear is the wisest character in the play. He is the only one who sees the king's mistakes from the beginning. This was a society that understood that wisdom could come from unexpected places. That sometimes the person who looks like a fool is the only one seeing things clearly. Then there was the concept of the holy fool, or the fool for Christ. This was a figure, especially prominent in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, but also present in the West, who feigned madness or stupidity for religious reasons. They would walk around in rags, say outrageous things, and deliberately violate social conventions. And they were living a life of extreme humility, rejecting all worldly praise and status. They were a living parable. They showed the world that God's wisdom is not the same as human wisdom. The Apostle Paul wrote, "For the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight." The holy fool took that idea and lived it. They were often revered. People believed they had a special connection to God. Their seemingly mad pronouncements were sometimes seen as prophecies. They were a constant, disruptive presence, reminding a hierarchical society of a different set of values. This worldview also had a place for people with physical and mental disabilities. It was not a modern, inclusive view. It was often paternalistic and based on pity. But it was a view. In a Christian framework, the sick, the lame, and the poor were not just social problems. They were an opportunity to practice charity. They were a representation of the suffering Christ himself, and caring for them was a path to salvation. The hagiographies, the stories of the saints, are filled with miracles of healing. A saint encounters a leper, a blind man, or a cripple, and cures them. On one hand, this shows a desire to eliminate disability. But on the other hand, it shows that these people were visible, They were part of the story. They were not hidden away. The village community often had a place for the person we might call simple. They might not be able to do the same work as others, but they would be given tasks they could handle. They would be known by everyone. They were part of the social fabric. This was not always kind. They could be mocked and mistreated, but they were not invisible. They were not institutionalized. Their presence was a part of daily life. They did not believe that a person's worth was based on their intelligence, their beauty, or their ability to produce. They believed a person's worth came from the fact that they had a soul created by God. And that soul was precious, whether it was housed in the body of a king, a peasant, a scholar, or a fool. We have a society that is, in many ways, more humane. We have better medicine, better social services. But we may have lost something. We may have lost the ability to see the value in the imperfect, the strange, and the broken. We may have lost the ability to hear the wisdom in the voice of the fool. But was the jester's freedom to speak truth or reality, or just a carefully managed performance to make the king feel magnanimous? Was the holy fool a revered spiritual figure, or a mentally ill person whose suffering was romanticized by others? And was the daily presence of disabled people in the community a sign of inclusion, or a constant and brutal reminder of their dependence and marginalization? What did they truly see when they looked at the people we refuse to look at all?